Don't move,
Don't move.
the man said
Come
low
with
and
me.
even.
Right
Come with
now.
me, right now. Victoria Harrington stopped 3 steps from her own front door. She had walked out of her estate in a charcoal blazer, a leather portfolio under one arm, her mind already on a deal worth hundreds of millions. Now a stranger in a grease-stained maintenance uniform stood directly in her path. Her hand drifted toward her phone until she saw his face and found no panic there, only certainty. Something beneath her ordered life had come loose, and this man already knew what it was. If stories about ordinary people doing the right thing are why you're here, take a second to subscribe before we go back to where this began. Marcus Johnson had been awake since 4:30 that morning. That was nothing new. He was always the first one on the grounds, moving through the estate's service corridors before the kitchen staff arrived, before the security rotation changed, before the world that lived inside these walls decided to wake up and remember it needed things. He carried his toolbox with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that the less attention he drew, the better. Not because he was ashamed of his work, because invisibility in a place like this was simply how the job got done. The Harrington estate sat on the edge of the hills north of the city, the kind of property that didn't need a gate to announce its wealth. The gate was just a formality. Manicured hedges lined the main driveway. Cameras covered every exterior angle. The main residence was pale stone with high windows that caught the morning light and threw it back like a warning. Marcus had worked here for 3 years, and in that time he'd fixed the boiler twice, rewired. 2 of the guest cottage outlets replaced a cracked pipe in the eastern garden wall, and once spent an entire afternoon tracking down a fault in the perimeter lighting that everyone else had given up on. He knew this property the way a surgeon knows a body, not from the outside, but from everything underneath. His son Eli was 8 years old and currently asleep in a rented 2-bedroom apartment 20 minutes away. Every morning, Marcus left before Eli woke, and every evening he came back in time to heat dinner and sit across the table from a boy who had his mother's eyes and his father's habit of going quiet when something was wrong. Eli's mother had left 4 years ago, not dramatically, not cruelly, just steadily, until one day she was gone, and Marcus was holding a 4-year-old who kept asking when she was coming back. He'd stopped waiting for that answer a long time ago. What he had instead was a routine, a paycheck, and a kid who deserved better than a father who came home broken. So Marcus did not come home broken. He came home tired, yes, but steady. Always steady. Victoria Harrington, by contrast, was a woman built around control. Marcus had seen her up close only a handful of times, usually from a distance crossing the main terrace with her phone pressed to her ear, or standing at her second-floor office window watching the driveway like someone reading a chessboard. She was in her early 40s with a posture that came not from confidence, but from years of learning that any softness would be used against her. She'd been married once to a man whose name appeared occasionally in the financial press, alongside words like fraud investigation and civil settlement. The divorce had been quiet but total. People said she'd changed after it. Marcus wouldn't know. He'd never met the version of her that existed before. What he did know was that she ran one of the largest real estate development firms on the West Coast, that she had a meeting in the city that morning her assistant had mentioned twice the previous afternoon in escalating tones, and that she was not a woman who tolerated delays. He was crouched near the electrical panel beside the main garage when he heard them. 2 male voices, low and close, coming from the far side of the vehicle bay. Marcus stayed still. In his experience, people spoke freely around maintenance workers the same way they spoke freely around furniture, because they decided without really thinking about it that there was no one there worth worrying about. "The mountain road," one of them said. "Third curve on the way down. That's where it happens." The other voice, quieter, "Brake line or the sensor override." "Override. On my mark. It reads as a failure, nothing to find. And you walk away from it. I'll know it's coming. She won't." Marcus did not move. He kept his eyes on the panel and his hands on his tools, but his mind was already turning over what he'd heard. He told himself it could be anything, a construction conversation, a job on some other property. He told himself a lot of things in the next 30 seconds, and none of them held up. Because 20 minutes earlier, he'd noticed something that hadn't registered as important. Until right now, a smear of fresh grease on the undercarriage of Victoria's car in the wrong place. Not the grease of normal wear, the kind that came from someone working fast in the dark. The two men moved off. Marcus waited until their footsteps disappeared, then crossed to Victoria's vehicle parked and idling ready in the motor court just outside the garage. He crouched low, aimed his flashlight under the chassis, and found it within seconds. A device compact, deliberately placed wired straight into the brake system. Not a manufacturer component, not a repair. Something assembled by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly how little time they had to do it. He stood up. His heart was moving fast, but his face was not. He'd learned that particular skill from fatherhood, the ability to feel something extreme on the inside while keeping the outside completely still, because there was a child watching, and the child needed to believe everything was fine. Victoria was already walking out the front door. She had on the charcoal blazer and dark trousers, the portfolio under one arm, her phone in her other hand. She wasn't looking at anything except the car waiting for her across the motor court, where a driver in a dark jacket stood by the open rear door. Marcus stepped out of the garage and moved to intercept her before she reached it. He was aware of how this looked. He was a black man in a maintenance uniform, stepping into the path of the woman who owned the estate. And he was aware of every inch of that, and he moved through it anyway, because there was no version of what he'd just found under that car that let him stand aside. "Don't move," he said quietly. "I need you to come with me, before you get in that car." Victoria stopped. Her expression cycled through three things: fast, surprise, irritation, and then something harder to name, something adjacent to suspicion. She looked at him the way people look at a problem they haven't decided how to file. Her hand tightened on her phone. "Excuse me." Her voice was measured, the kind of calm that's really a different kind of sharp. "I work maintenance here. 3 years. My name is Marcus Johnson." He kept his voice level. "There's something under your car you need to see for yourself. 60 seconds. Then you can call whoever you want." It was the directness that made her hesitate. He wasn't asking. He wasn't threatening. He was telling her something in the flat tone of a man who had already weighed every alternative and thrown them all out. Victoria glanced toward the driver still standing patiently by the rear door, then back at Marcus. Whatever she calculated in those 2 seconds, it landed somewhere she hadn't expected. 60 seconds, she said. He didn't need them. He led her the few steps to the car, crouched, and put the flashlight on the device without another word. Victoria leaned in. She was close enough that he heard her breathing change, a small catch quickly controlled. She studied the thing in silence, and he watched her understand it. Not as an object, as an intention. She straightened slowly. The morning light was coming through the garage's high windows, now falling across the concrete in long, pale strips. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Who else knows about this?" she asked. The formality was gone from her voice. "No one yet," Marcus said. Victoria took one breath, then another, and what crossed her face wasn't only fear. It was the look of someone realizing that the world they thought they'd been navigating is not the world they're actually in, that something beneath the surface of their life has been moving without their knowledge and has been moving for a while. She pulled out her phone and called her assistant. "Clear my 9 o'clock. I need 2 hours." No explanation. She hung up. Then she turned back to Marcus. "Don't touch anything else and don't go anywhere." It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't warmth. But it was a decision made fast to treat him as someone whose information mattered. Marcus hadn't expected warmth. He'd expected to be dismissed or worse. Instead, Victoria Harrington was standing in her own motor court on a Tuesday morning staring at a device wired into her brakes, and the only person she'd told was him. He set the flashlight on the hood and looked at the driver still waiting by the rear door, calm and unhurried. "When did Raymond stop driving you?" Marcus asked. Victoria turned. "How do you know my driver's name?" "Because I've watched Raymond pull through that gate every morning for 2 years," Marcus said. "That's not Raymond." The replacement's name was Derek, according to the badge on his jacket. Victoria had never laid eyes on him before. When she walked over and asked directly where Raymond was, Derek said Raymond had called in sick and the agency had sent him over. He said it evenly without a blink, with the smoothness of a man reciting something he'd practiced. Victoria thanked him and told him he could go. Derek's expression shifted by almost nothing, but Marcus, standing 3 feet behind her, caught it, a flicker of recalculation. Then the man nodded, got in the car, and drove out through the gate. 2 of the estate's security staff arrived within minutes of her call. Grant and Paulson, both former law enforcement, both hired through a firm Victoria's team, had vetted hard. Grant was the senior, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, who stood slightly sideways, like he was always expecting trouble from the left. He listened to Victoria's account, then turned to Marcus with an expression that had nothing to do with listening. It was the look of a man who'd already decided what kind of situation this was and where Marcus fit inside it. "You found the device," Grant said, not a question. "I did. And you were in the garage this morning, alone, before anyone else got here." Marcus understood exactly what was happening, and he'd decided before Grant finished his first sentence that the smartest thing he could do was stay still and let the facts speak. Getting defensive would only feed what Grant already wanted to believe. So Marcus answered each question directly and offered nothing that wasn't asked. Paulson, the younger of the 2, was less interested in Marcus and more interested in the car. He crouched by the chassis with a small light of his own, confirmed the device was real, then stepped back and told Grant flatly that nobody should touch the vehicle until the police arrived, which, whatever else it did, kept the scene intact. Victoria said nothing to soften Grant's tone. She stood with her arms folded and her face unreadable, and Marcus filed that away without anger. He understood that too. She'd known him for about 20 minutes in any real sense. Trust wasn't something you handed a stranger just because the stranger had done something that looked like help. That was a lesson she'd learned the hard way, and the bruises from it were still visible in how she held herself. The police came 40 minutes later. 2 officers, then a detective named Reeves in a gray jacket who asked his questions in the careful, neutral tone of a man who treated every answer as potentially false. They examined the device, photographed it, bagged it for the lab. Reeves spoke to Grant, then to Victoria, and then came to Marcus last, which was its own kind of statement. "Walk me through your morning," Reeves said. Marcus did, arriving at 4:30. Starting on the electrical panel by the garage, the 2 voices, crossing to the car, the device. He laid it out in sequence without embellishment, the way he'd described tracing a fault in a circuit methodically, because precision was the only thing he had to offer. Reeves made notes. "The 2 men. You didn't see their faces." "No. I heard them from the other side of the bay. By the time I worked out what they were saying, they'd moved off." "Convenient," Reeves said, not hostile, just an observation which carried more weight than hostility would have. Marcus said nothing to that because there was nothing useful to say. While Reeves was still with Grant near the garage entrance, Marcus crossed quietly to the security station, a small room off the main corridor that housed the camera system. He'd serviced the hardware in there twice and knew the interface. He pulled the overnight footage from the garage exterior and scrolled back. Not because anyone had asked him to, but because he was the only person in the building with a reason to move quickly. He found it at 2:17 in the morning. A figure in dark clothing moving along the side of the garage with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew where the cameras pointed. The figure crouched by Victoria's car for roughly 11 minutes, then withdrew the way they'd come. The face stayed angled away from every lens, no accident. But the build, the gait, the small pause at the corner before turning, those were in the footage, whether the face was or not. He pulled a second feed, the east service entrance. At 2:09 minutes before the figure reached the garage, a vehicle had come through the service gate on what looked like a valid access code, not a car that belonged to any regular staff. Marcus wrote the partial plate on a scrap of paper from his pocket. He brought both to Reeves. The detective watched the footage without expression, looked at the partial plate, then looked at Marcus with something that wasn't quite a change of mind, but was at least a loosening of the original one. "How'd you know to pull the east feed?" "Whoever did this knew the camera positions," Marcus said. "That means they'd been here before. And if they'd been here before, they came in through a gate. The east service entrance has the weakest logging made sense to start there." Reeves studied him a moment. "What did you say you do here?" "Maintenance, electrical, and mechanical." The detective wrote something down and didn't say anything else. It was early afternoon, police still on the grounds, Victoria pacing somewhere upstairs on the phone with her lawyers, when Marcus's cell buzzed in his pocket. He stepped out of the security room to read it, and what was on the screen stopped him where he stood. It was from his neighbor Dolores, a retired teacher who watched Eli in the mornings before the bus and met him again at the afternoon stop. The message said a man came by the school this afternoon asking about Eli. "Someone I've never seen." He knew his full name. Marcus read it twice. Then he called her. Dolores picked up on the second ring and described the man carefully, medium height, dark jacket, said he'd asked which boy was Eli Johnson, then walked off when the school staff came out. She told Marcus that Eli was fine, that she'd stayed at the stop until she had him by the hand, that the boy was sitting at her kitchen table right now, eating crackers and doing nothing more dangerous than a worksheet. Marcus thanked her and kept his voice level for the whole call, and when he hung up, he stood in the corridor for a few seconds and let himself feel the full weight of it. They knew he'd gotten in the way, and they were telling him they knew. It had taken them most of the day, long enough for someone inside this house to learn that the maintenance man had found the device, that he'd talked to the police, that he was a problem now. Long enough to find out he had a son and where that son went to school. Whoever was behind this hadn't reached down from some great distance. They'd been close the whole time. He went back in and found Victoria standing at the window of the main hall, away from the officers looking out at the empty driveway. She'd been like that a while, still contained, working something through privately. Marcus came and stood nearby without crowding her. "They know I got in the way," he said quietly. "Someone went to my son's school this afternoon, asked for him by name." Victoria turned. Whatever she'd been working through, this cut clean through it. "How old is your son?" 8. Something moved across her face. Not pity, which he wouldn't have wanted, but recognition. She understood what it was to have something precious, and to feel it suddenly within reach of people who had no right to touch it. "Do you need to go?" "I called someone I trust. She's got him until I figure this out. But I need you to understand something." He held her eyes. "Whoever's doing this already knows your security has a gap, and already knows I found it. That means they're adjusting, and whatever comes next is going to come fast." Victoria held his gaze a moment, then nodded once slowly, the way someone nods when they're agreeing to something larger than the words just spoken. But the day wasn't finished with them. By mid-afternoon, 2 things arrived almost together. The first was a note from the forensic team. The device carried no prints, no traceable parts, no link to any known supplier. It had been built deliberately to leave nothing behind. The second was a phone call to Reeves from an anonymous source claiming to have watched Marcus tampering with the car the night before. The caller described him precisely and referenced a detail about the east garage entrance that had not been made public. Within the hour, Marcus was asked to come in for formal questioning. Grant watched him leave with the officers from the doorway, arms folded. There was no satisfaction in the man's face, but there was no discomfort in it either. The story had been turned around, quietly, surgically, with the kind of precision that took planning. Victoria was in the main hall when she heard. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Claire, brought the update anonymous tip, formal questioning Marcus taken in for a statement. And then the financial director appeared, Gerald Sutton. He had been Victoria's most senior advisor for 6 years, 61 silver-haired with the easy authority of a man used to being the smartest person in most rooms he walked into. "I heard what happened," Gerald said in the careful tone he used when he was being careful. "I just want to say be cautious. You don't know this man. He put himself in your path this morning and now everything is chaos. That's worth thinking about." Victoria looked at him. She had known him 6 years. She had trusted him with the internal machinery of her company in ways she'd trusted almost no one. And standing there listening, she noticed something she hadn't before, a quality in his concern that sat slightly wrong, like a room where the furniture's been moved an inch. Nothing you could name, just a wrongness in the arrangement. She thanked him and said she'd keep it in mind. Then she sat alone in her office and thought about Marcus Johnson, the economy of how he'd moved that morning, the absence of performance. She thought about what he'd found and how fast he'd found it, and how a man looking to milk a crisis for personal gain would have handled it very differently. She thought about the 2 voices he'd described, the partial plate he'd pulled, the way he'd answered Grant and Reeves without once losing his footing. Then she thought about Gerald's voice and the shape of his concern. Outside, the afternoon light was shifting across the empty driveway. Marcus was in a station somewhere across town. His 8-year-old was at a retired teacher's kitchen table because a stranger had come asking. Victoria had every reason to walk away from this. She could call her lawyers, issue a statement, let the investigation run without her, and be in a rescheduled meeting by tomorrow morning. No one would blame her. No one would even question it. She picked up her phone and called her private attorney instead. "I need everything we have on Gerald Sutton," she said. "Quietly. Tonight." She didn't know yet whether she was right, but she knew the man who'd stepped into her path that morning was not the kind of man who deserved to be left there alone. The report came back at 11:17 that night. Victoria was still at her desk, the lamp the only light in the room, a cold cup of coffee untouched beside her keyboard. Her attorney, a methodical woman named Sandra Briggs, had worked fast. What she sent wasn't a complete picture. There hadn't been time. But it was enough. Over the past 14 months, Gerald Sutton had moved quietly into a position no one had authorized him to occupy. Small transfers, each individually defensible, each requiring his signature, and no one else's. A consulting arrangement with a holding company that had no visible connection to anything until you read the holding company's registration documents, which listed a secondary contact address matching the private office of a commercial real estate broker. The same broker who 3 months ago had made a preliminary approach to 2 of Victoria's largest investors about acquiring her firm. Gerald hadn't been trying to steal from her. He'd been trying to replace her. And for that to close cleanly, Victoria Harrington needed to not be alive on the day it did. She sat with that for a long moment. 6 years. He had stood at her father's funeral. He had flown with her to 4 cities for negotiations. He had sat at her own dining table and eaten her food and asked after her health, and the whole time he'd been building something in the background that required her death as a precondition. She did not cry. She felt no urge to. What she felt was a cold, clarifying anger, the kind that doesn't burn hot, but burns long and is far more dangerous for it. She called Sandra back. "I need you to reach Detective Reeves directly. Not the department's general line, his personal number, which I'll need you to find. Tell him I have financial documentation that establishes motive and that I want Marcus Johnson released before 8 tomorrow morning. Whatever Reeves needs in writing to move tonight, I'll have to him within the hour." Sandra asked if she was sure she wanted to move this fast. "I should have moved faster," Victoria said. "Make the call." She sent the records over in a compressed folder, flagged the key transfers, then pulled up the camera metadata Marcus had surfaced that morning, the partial plate from the east gate, the timestamps and the gate analysis she'd had her private security consultant run on the garage footage after Marcus was taken in. The consultant had come back with an 83% match against Derek, the replacement driver, who'd shown up that morning and driven off without a word the moment she dismissed him. 83% was not a courtroom number on its own, but paired with the financial records with the anonymous tip that had landed minutes after Marcus identified the East entrance footage, and with the fact that Gerald Sutton had personally approved Derek's placement through the staffing agency, it became something else. And the staffing detail was the part that turned her stomach. Gerald hadn't approved a same-day replacement for a driver who called in sick. He'd approved Derek 2 days earlier. 2 days before any of this, the slot had already been arranged. When Sandra's people pulled the agency records that night, they found that Raymond had received a message formatted to look like it came from the estate's own scheduling office, telling him his services weren't required for 2 days with pay. Raymond hadn't been sick. He hadn't called anyone. He'd been quietly moved out of the way days in advance so that the man behind the wheel on the mountain road would be one of theirs. Because that was the shape of it once you understood the device. It wasn't crude brake cutting that any driver might feel going wrong. It was a sensor override brakes that would hold normally and then fail on a single command at a single chosen point and read afterward as a simple mechanical failure with nothing left to find. Raymond, loyal and unsuspecting, was a liability twice over. He might react in a way that saved them both. And if he lived, he'd be a witness who swore the brakes had just gone. Derek was the controlled variable. Derek would know the exact curve, the exact moment. He could brace-aim the car and walk away from a crash designed to kill the woman in the back seat who never saw it coming. I'll know it's coming. She won't. Marcus had heard the whole plan and hadn't known it yet. It became a pattern, and patterns in Victoria's experience were what courts were actually built to read. Reeves called her at 12:40. He'd reviewed the documents. His voice had a different quality now, not warmer exactly, but more careful, the way a careful man sounds when he realizes he's been working from an incomplete map. He asked 3 clarifying questions about the transfers, and she answered all 3 without hesitation. Before they hung up, he told her Marcus Johnson would be released first thing in the morning, pending formal clearance of the new evidence, and that on the strength of the financial trail, a warrant for Gerald Sutton's records was being drafted with an arrest warrant to follow the moment those records confirmed what hers already showed. Victoria thanked him and set the phone down. Through the window, the grounds were dark and still. The garage sat at the far end of the drive doors, closed, ordinary-looking, and completely silent. She thought about Marcus spending the night in a holding room because he'd done the right thing at 4:30 in the morning before anyone else was awake, and she felt the weight of that in a way that was specific and uncomfortable and necessary. Marcus was released at 7:50 the next morning. He hadn't slept. The holding room had a plastic chair fluorescent light, and the particular silence of a place designed to make you feel the passage of time. He'd spent most of the night thinking about Eli running the same mental checklist he always ran when he was separated from his son and couldn't do anything about it. Dolores would keep him fed. She'd get him to school. She wouldn't tell him anything that would scare him. Marcus had built a system around Eli's safety made mostly of people he trusted, and right now he was leaning on every part of it. When the officer came to tell him he was free to go, Marcus stood, took his jacket off the back of the chair, and walked out without asking a single question. The explanation could come later. Right now, he needed to see his son. The morning light hit him at the front steps of the station, clean and sharp after the fluorescent inside. He stood there and took one full breath, and that was when he saw Dolores's car at the curb. And standing beside it in his school backpack and a jacket slightly too big for him was Eli. The boy saw his father and crossed the distance at a run. Marcus came down the steps and caught him, and for a moment he just held on one hand across the back of Eli's head, his eyes closed. Eli didn't ask what had happened. He just held on with the full-body grip of a child who's been waiting and is done waiting. Marcus breathed and steadied and let everything that had been compressed inside him since the day before slowly come loose. Dolores stood by the car with her hands folded in the manner of a woman who'd seen enough of life to know when to give people a moment. When Marcus finally looked up at her, She gave him a single nod that held more than most speeches. "Thank you," he said. "Buy me dinner sometime," she said. "Now go home and let this boy eat a real breakfast." Gerald Sutton was arrested at 9:40 that same morning at the departure gate of an international terminal, 2 checked bags and a one-way ticket in his name. He had moved the instant the ground shifted under him, the moment word reached him that Victoria had survived, that the maintenance man had been released, that the tidy story he'd built was coming apart in her hands. He wasn't fleeing in triumph. He was cutting his losses and running for a border, betting he had a window to get clear before anyone connected the money to him. He'd misjudged the window. The records warrant had been executed overnight, the arrest warrant signed on the back of it, and when the officers met him at the gate, what crossed his face was mostly surprise. Not that the plan had failed, but that they'd unraveled it this fast, that a 14-month construction had been read in a single night and a half. That miscalculation cost him everything. He had spent 6 years, certain he was the smartest person in the room, and he had been beaten by a maintenance man with a flashlight and a woman who decided against all her own instincts to trust what she'd seen. Derek was picked up that afternoon at a motel 30 miles south of the city. The partial plate, Marcus had noted, matched the rental parked outside his room. Inside, investigators found a prepaid phone whose call log ran straight to a number tied to the holding company in Gerald's records, and threaded through that same log a second number belonging to the man who'd come through the east gate at 2:09 and crouched under Victoria's car for 11 minutes. The technician. The one whose hands had left fresh grease in the wrong place. The 2 voices Marcus had overheard in the dark were no longer anonymous, the driver who would steer the car and the man who had wired it to fail. Both of them, in the end, were just instruments Gerald Sutton had paid for. The case, as Sandra Briggs told Victoria that evening, was not going to be complicated to prosecute. A few days later, Victoria asked Marcus to come to the estate, not through the maintenance scheduling system, through a direct message to his personal number, which she'd taken from his employment file. "When you're ready, no rush. There's something I'd like to say in person." He came on a quiet afternoon. Eli was in school, Dolores was home, and Marcus drove to the estate in his own car for the first time, not through the service entrance, but through the main gate, where a staff member he didn't recognize waved him through without a question. The grounds looked exactly as they always had. The hedges, the pale stone, the high windows catching the light. He'd spent 3 years learning the inside of this place and almost none of its surface, and it struck him as faintly strange now, the way things do when the context shifts and you see them new. Victoria met him in the garden on the east side of the residence, a space he'd passed through many times to service the irrigation, but had never once stood in as a guest. A bench, a low table, and the kind of afternoon stillness that belongs to places tended carefully for a long time. She was already there when he arrived, dressed simply, no blazer, no portfolio, and she looked like a version of herself that was a little less constructed than the one he'd met at the front door. She thanked him first directly and without preamble, which he respected. Then she told him what she'd decided. She would cover Eli's education in full from now through college, wherever he chose to go. And she was offering Marcus a position director of technical security for the Harrington Group, overseeing the safety infrastructure of every property and facility the company ran. It was a role that didn't currently exist that she was creating because the past few days had made one thing very clear. The gap in her organization hadn't been in her legal team or her financial oversight or her physical security roster. The gap was in someone who actually understood how the systems beneath everything worked and who would act on what they found. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he asked about the scope of the role, 2 practical questions about reporting structure and team size, and she answered both specifically. He said he'd think about it, and she nodded as though she'd expected exactly that answer and found it right. Then she looked at him in the way she'd been looking at him since the garage, like she was still recalibrating something. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why did you stop me?" she said. You could have called it in, left a note, found some way to flag it that didn't involve stepping in front of me on my own driveway. Why do it like that? Marcus looked out across the garden. At the far end, near the hedge line, a gardener was working with his back to them, and the small, steady sounds of careful work were the only thing moving in the afternoon air. Marcus thought about Eli, about the morning routine, about the discipline of coming home steady when what you felt was something else entirely. Because there wasn't time to do it any other way, he said. And because I've got a son, I'm going to have to look in the eye every day for the rest of my life. I didn't want to be the man who saw something wrong and found a reason to keep walking. Victoria was quiet for a moment, not the managed quiet she used in meetings, but something more open than that. I spent 6 years trusting the wrong man, she said, and 30 seconds trusting you, and the 30 seconds were the ones that were right. She said it plainly, without self-pity, in the tone of someone making an honest accounting. I'm not sure what that says about me. It says you trusted what you saw, Marcus said, when it mattered enough. She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, but the way a room changes when a window opens and the air moves. She turned toward the garden where the gardener was still working, and after a moment, she said very quietly, I think I'd like to be that kind of person more often. Marcus said nothing to that. He didn't need to. Some things land better when you let them settle on their own. The light was long and pale across the garden, and for a while the two of them just sat with it, a man who'd spent 3 years invisible in a place, and a woman who'd spent 6 years looking at the wrong things, both of them facing the same direction, watching the same quiet garden, breathing the same still air. Here's the thing this story leaves behind. Most of us will never find a device wired under a car, but almost all of us at some point will see something that isn't right and feel that small, quiet pull to keep walking, to tell ourselves it's not our business, that someone else will handle it. Marcus's whole life came down to a decision not to be that person. It cost him a brutal day. And it gave a boy a father he could look in the eye, and gave a guarded woman one reason to believe that people can still surprise you. If that landed for you, consider subscribing and sticking around. These are the kinds of stories we tell here, and there's always another one on the way. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. That genuinely means something. Take care of yourselves out there, and the next time you see something that's wrong, maybe don't walk past it.